So just want to use this to show basically the overview of what our expectations are for neuroscience. So for me, I'm super passionate about neuroscience because I think it provides us with an opportunity to understand a little bit about how we do the things we do. So I'm interested in mechanisms, but behavior and what we see in terms of our presentation. So I am a behavioral neuroscientist by training. And so I'm fascinated by the way in which we operate as humans, cultures, societies, individuals, organisms. And I'm really fascinated by how we get to accomplish those things. I think neuroscience provides a really useful set of tools that help us with understanding systems, that show a lot of times how the individual parts can come together and produce something greater than what you had in the individual parts, these emergent properties that come out of, what is a thought? These are some of the questions that I really enjoy that I think neuroscience provides us an opportunity to study. So this slide deck I'm going through right now, and I can make this available. I think most of the monasteries will already have this because we presented this at the beginning of the 6th year. Our goals being to demonstrate what our intentions were for each of the years in the curriculum. So what are the basic fundamentals, right? In neuroscience, we study that through defining what we mean by acquiring information. How do you collect data and prepare it? And you'll see that in some of our activities in the first year, we're looking at how do we get information? How do you conduct research? What is the physical process of collecting and getting this information? And so we align that with some of the life sciences, asking questions in science, and you'll see the scientific method come out here, and we do that. Sensation and perception is a big theme for the 2nd year, and that is how do you interact with the world? And so I like to think about that as how does information out there get in here, right? And then what do you do with it? So when you sense something, you collect information from the environment, and then you do something useful with it, you process it, and that's your perception, and you can construct your reality out of it. So there's a structure-function relationship associated with that, and we get some more neuroanatomy language in the 2nd year. In the 3rd year, we start to think about electricity and chemistry in the nervous system. So how do you communicate within neurons and between neurons? And we talk about how you assemble these wonderful, beautiful, big central nervous systems out of these elements. So how within the cells you're making these communications, and that's where we study the action potential. How do you receive input? How do you transfer information? And these are basically the building blocks of the nervous system. Then as we have that all foundation laid together, we can start to think about higher processes or more complex things, sociality, empathy, right? These are things that I've found as I didn't get a chance to teach year 4, but when I think the students engage a lot with how this works. What is emotion? What does it look like? How does it scale across different cultures? How does learning and memory work? These little elements that we can start to chip away at with our tools in neuroscience, and the different types of tools. So what are the elements that we can rely on that teach us more about what we are interested in? In the 5th year, this is an area that's also really dear to me. I studied sleep for my dissertation. And so these biological rhythms, like why am I tired at this point in the day? Why do the monks leave for tea and then maybe not come back because they took a nap? Why can you pay attention this long and not? How does stress interact with the body? What is chronic stress? What is acute stress? So a lot of it is using the foundations that we laid in the first 3 years and then thinking about adaptations and plasticity. And so you'll notice I'm just focusing on the neuroscience side here, and hopefully Kelsey will be able to kind of tie them all back together. But I really just want you to see what our idea was in terms of how to approach the neuroscience education. And I think about it kind of like a funnel. So you start with a big picture, a big idea. what is neuroscience? What is the research that we can do? How do you ask questions? What scientific method is really big? And then you get more focused on, you know, the organism and then the structures in the brain. And then we're at the cellular level. And then we come back out into behaviors, emotion, cognition, and then big rhythms, right? And so I think by the time we do all that, when you get to the 6th year, you can look at the mind and the body and how it relates together. You can have these very complex ideas like communication. How are we doing what we're doing right now? How are we able to accomplish this virtual communication and still have an idea that I am in the screen, but I'm somewhere else? How do we know where people are, or what they're, how do you know that their representation is the same as your representation, or maybe they aren't, right? What is the self and where does that end? How do you really study things like these complicated things that I believe maybe Buddhist monks have a better opportunity to study some of these concepts, but here is our attempt in the sciences to do that. So I wanted to just review that very quickly, and then here's where I ask you if you have some questions based on what we have, what I've shown you, or what we've stepped through. No questions so far? Robin, have I done an injustice to the neuroscience curriculum so far?
Not at all. It was perfect.
Okay.
The one thing I will say is that, you know, the research program that we'll be doing will be nicely aligning with Gillian's interest in sleep. And so you'll actually have the opportunity to take what you're learning and apply it to the research side of things. So there'll be, I think, a real synergy on that aspect of things. And you'll learn more about sleep on next Wednesday. But yeah.
So that was accidental, but also quite fortuitous. So very lucky for us to have someone who, or someone's, so several people within our neuroscience community. So Carol Worthman studied sleep in an anthropological context for years. And as the architect of our neuroscience curriculum, she tried to be very careful about forcing too much of her own interest in there. I don't have the same reluctance as Carol did. I am like, sleep is interesting. When I have conversations sometimes with the monastic students, we talk a little bit more about how sleep works. And I think if that's something that they're interested in, it's a really important hook to catch on to for us to get more information. So you can learn a whole lot about what our systems do when you can get some basic neuroanatomy, structure, function, all these relationships you can, that are inherent across many neuroscience domains, you can get out of that complex behavior. You can get some cultural aspects. You can study it at the very cellular level, the neurotransmitter level, all the way up to the social group level. How do people sleep in groups? How do they sleep on their own? Circadian rhythms. There's so many things in that system that I think it really provides an opportunity for us to study all the things we want to know. But it's also interesting and relevant, and we all do it, right? So you kind of have a feeling, or what we call like a folk psychology around what sleep is and does. So that was something that I thought was a really unique opportunity we had to have our investigators. So many of you might know Elizaveta Solomonova, who is at McGill, and she studies sleep. And so she's taught in the program, and she wants to engage with the research program and provide opportunities for you. So we can translate different tests that we're using and have you start to do some of that research on your own. And I know Robin will go into detail on that later. Yes? Okay. I am going to share my overall curriculum for the upcoming sustainability phase as soon as I can find it. I've been teaching on Zoom for 6 or 7 months and still am surprised by how poorly I do it. All right, here we go. Sustainability phase and goals. So this is just going to be just a PDF, and it doesn't have any cool pictures, but let's do it. So I didn't get to watch Mina and Karma talking about pedagogy, but I'm pretty sure they would have told you Don't just throw up a wall of text and expect people to read it along with you. That's a really, really bad thing to do in education. So here's my wall of text that I'm going to show you. So do as I say, not as I do. The goal of the project for me, looking forward, is to figure out, and I've just bolded some sections, how neuroscience content knowledge has the capacity to influence how we teach. So learning about how the brain works and processes information, I think, is a really important strength of neuroscience. I use this expression all the time. Abraham Maslow is a researcher who said something along the lines of, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you understand that analogy is like, if you have this particular tool, when you look around you, everything that you do will be influenced by or have some application of that. And to me, that's what neuroscience is, and neuroethics, but we'll get into that some other time. For me, neuroscience provides an opportunity to learn about learning. It provides an opportunity to think back on what we know about how we know things, and then you can use that to extend your knowledge. So I want us to be thinking about the process of how we learn and how we remember things, and using that to drive how we teach, because some things work and some things don't work. So part of the reason that we have laboratory exercises or active learning components is because doing works better than watching. So if I see you doing something, I might learn it, but if I do it myself, it reinforces concepts in a way that's a little bit different. And I think it's really important. So my learning outcomes for students should match what the other instructors are looking for. I want the teachers of I want monastic science teachers to be able to evaluate their own content knowledge, recognize when you know and don't know something. The most valuable tool I have found in education is being able to recognize when you need more information, right? So I want the teachers to be able to do that. Recognizing that you're an expert in an area, but not in another area, and how that might influence what you teach and how you teach it. When do you need help? When do you need figures? When do you need to study something more before you start talking about it? I want to make sure that we are able to recognize the different types of ways that we're communicating or teaching, and that you can balance them appropriately to get the most out of it. I want you to be able to develop your own curricula. I want you to see when something works, so you can take from the students what they're getting and how to go with and or pursue an avenue that is more meaningful and provides more for your students in that space. So you want to be able to adapt, right? That flexibility. So the strategy I'm using for that is actually based on the Society for Neuroscience's essential principles of neuroscience. These are 8 core concepts that the society, which is the large, let's call it a governing body of neuroscientists throughout the world. There are about 30,000 people who are members of the society, folks who are thinking about neuroscience at different ways and in different levels. Now, to be completely transparent, these essential principles were derived for K through 12 education, that is for kindergarten through 12th grade. But that doesn't mean that it is simplistic. It just is trying to find out what are the main ideas that neuroscience attempts to understand and communicate. And I think they've done a marvelous job with this. So the 8 essential principles are here. I'm not going to read them to you from this list, but I'm going to tell you that I used these 8 to derive the 3-year curriculum for the sustainability phase. And what that looks like is in year 1, I want us to learn about learning, and that would have been this year, except that things have changed. So I want us to learn about learning. So neurons communicate using electrical and chemical signals. We covered that in year 3 of the original curriculum, but now we're going to look at it in a way that helps us to learn the content, but also learn how we're learning. Life experiences change the nervous system is another concept. And that's an important concept that we probably know, again, through folk psychology. You know that as you experience something, you get changes. This is the practice makes perfect. This is why we have years and years of practice. This is why the mini monks rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, right? As you experience something, your nervous system changes, and eventually you can do something like learning to ride a bicycle. Why aren't you thinking about it every step of the way? It becomes a part of your body's ability, and your nervous system contributes greatly to your ability to produce these movements without like thinking all the way through them. So how are your life experiences changing your nervous system in good and in bad ways, right? And so we can take the valuation out of that, but just accepting that life experiences change the nervous system and learning a little bit more about how. So we're going to think about if it is true that life experience changed the nervous system, if being exposed to something can change the way your brain is, then let's expose our brains to more neuroscience contexts so that it can do better and more with what we have. Finally, this is where we think about the research aspect. The human brain gives us a natural curiosity to understand how the world works. And you can see that in all sorts of organisms. There's a curiosity or an investigation. And so as you're approaching how the world works or how things work, that brain is the organ or the main part of the system that's allowing you to do that. I think in neuroscience, we probably have a challenge that other disciplines don't have, right? So in physics, you're studying these properties of the world, but you're using your brain to study it. In neuroscience, you're using your brain to study the brain, which sounds like it shouldn't be a big deal, but it really is. There are certain limitations to the brain and to certain limitations of how you understand things, but we're using the structure to understand the structure, and nowhere else in any other discipline do you have that particular conflict, right? So it's really fascinating to me, and probably one of the reasons I'm drawn to it is the limitation. It's like, okay, how much can we really get out of understanding a system when we're using that to understand it? So
Gillian, it makes me think of the quote that the brain is the most interesting thing in the universe according to the brain.
Exactly, right? Perfect. It's that self thing. It's like we're studying this, using this, and it's, of course, like why wouldn't the brain think it's the most fascinating thing? So in year 2, I want us to go back to this idea of the brain being the most complex organ. For a biologist like Kelsey, weigh in. Does that give you feelings when we say we've got the domain on? There are other complex organs, right? But it's relatively, we can all agree that it is probably the most complex. And then we're bringing in genetics here. So genetically determined circuits are the foundation of the nervous system. And I think that gives us an opportunity to tie into biology and the life sciences and how genetics really drive what we're doing. And then here's a pretty controversial topic in neuroscience is intelligence. How you define intelligence becomes important. And I think for us, as we start to think about the complexity of the brain and the nervous system, how we can reason, how we can plan, how we can solve problems, we can practice different strategies, and we can use cases that help us to figure out how to get at intelligence, how to understand solving a problem as great as this. Finally, in the 3rd year, we start applying things, right? So the brain makes it possible to communicate knowledge through language. Language is fascinating. And for me, being involved with the Emory Tibet Science Initiative has been really rewarding. I don't speak Tibetan. I know Tashi Delek, and I say it as often as I can. At one point, I think I could count up to 5 in Tibetan, right? But I mean, honestly, the fact that the students are listening to science, which is a language of itself, in another language and learning about it is remarkable and important. And knowing that they're doing this as an adult stage, right? Because a lot of what the foundations of understanding language and how it works really get built in very early in development. And so looking at some of this is fascinating to me. I also really just personally like the idea that Tibetans are keeping their language, that living outside of the context of Tibet, being away from home, but holding on to something important like your language is a really important part of identity. And I think that translating and not forcing the Tibetan monastic students to learn English just to learn science, I think is a really important innovation. And I don't know that maybe I don't agree with everyone, maybe it would be simpler or more efficient, but I do think that there is something really valuable about having the language and being able to communicate your knowledge through your own language. And so I think that's important. So I really like the idea of spending time understanding how language works, how language frames how you think, right? There are certain concepts, and there are really nice studies that we can look at too, with ideas or concepts that you just can't get because, or it's difficult because you just don't have a word for it in your language, or certain feelings that you can have because you have a word for it, certain ways you can express yourself or engage because of language. And so these are things, and why I think this is a really nice way to summarize the 3-year pedagogy course. So what I'm describing here is the sustainability phase with what we're trying to teach you, knowing that you are going to be doing your own planning, your own curriculum, your own development of courses, and what you think is important. But what I want to provide for you is the capacity to understand how the brain does some of these things and how neuroscience contributes to that. I want you to be able to make direct connections between research questions in other disciplines, in ETSI, how you can think about research collaborations, how you can start to ask questions that are important to you based on what we're giving you. So that's my brief, not brief, overview of what I think is important for us going into the next phase. What questions do you have at this point? No questions? That's either really good or really bad. Okay. All right. Well, I'm at least seeing some smiles, so I'll accept that. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to show you, since you don't have any questions, is my website here, where I got this all from. So I'm going to go here and go here and go here, share. All right, so the Essential Principles of Neuroscience is available at brainfacts.org. There's no secret to this, it's open source information. So what I've put together as the syllabus or my pedagogical approach for the next 3 years is drawn heavily, exclusively from these essential principles. And I'm very proud of it. In fact, even though, like I said, it's through 12th grade education level, I think that it is a really, really neat, important opportunity. If you wanted to, as a teacher, go through and see how to employ some of these neuroscience curriculum, they actually have a matrix that shows how the neuroscience core concepts map onto the educational system in the United States. And I don't know if that matches for India or the monastic, but you can actually do some of this yourself. I'm going to click on this, and I don't know if this will, yes, allow. Okay, all right. So you're probably not seeing the screen I'm seeing because it opened something else. I'm going to stop the share and then try again and see that. So this is the Neuroscience Core Concepts. It's a PDF that you can download. It has every single one of them. So these are the 8 core concepts you can see across here that we talked about. And this is how it's broken down, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they categorize them. Nervous system controls and responds to body functions and directs behavior. And then down here, well, there's my dog, which is also important too. But you can look at, and this again is, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Maybe you can see that. Matter and stability, energy, these don't match, right? But it does match on waves and their applications in technologies for information transfer. So if you wanted to look at all sorts of different things, so you could see here, most of these are physics, right? They're physical science concepts. So that doesn't qualify for this. However, in the life sciences, you can see where it maps on and where these different categories. And so this is what I use. Life experiences, you can see the clusters of where the information starts to add up. So typically in the US, they have this system where they want to teach people physical sciences, life sciences, engineering. And you can look at where some of the neuroscience core concepts overlap so that you can provide for your students not just how it works, but here, for instance, let's look at this one. Brain knowledge and language, brain and curiosity about the world, and then it maps onto the standards that are set up for engineering design. So it's sort of interesting to think about how neuroscience and the elements of neuroscience might be part of a design or an engineering. Like, how would you design a system that works in a particular way? How is research going to help you to understand fundamental discoveries that promote health and how neuroscience can align with that? So I think that that's a useful resource for you, and I will provide it. You can find it, you can Google it, but I also am happy to share with you how I think it's useful as you design your own curriculum, because I expect that you will be able to do that. You'll be able to see what works at Sarah isn't necessarily going to work at Drepung. You know what you're studying, you know what you want to do, and maybe we can, you know, of course, trade information across the different institutions. But if you are the science teacher and you've got, you know, fifth graders as well as, you know, college level folks, it is up to you to determine what works in what area. And I want to be able to provide you with the resources to do that. Let me go back to, because I'm all over the place here, but hopefully you're still keeping up with me. So if I go back to the main page, there you go. Looking at the core concepts, you see all of them. They have interactives available as well, right? So this, again, is just an introduction. I'm just showing you what there is, but how research benefits human health, the power of language. And so you have the capacity to go through all these. And it just outlines a little bit more about what we do. Communication can create and solve many of the most pressing problems. And you can learn about language from different species, right? Bird song. So there's lots of different opportunities embedded within that overall curricular design. Yes? Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, so with that, unless you have specific questions for me right now, I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to integrate us all.
I think I would like to add a point, if I may.
Please.
Yeah. So I mean, ma'am, you showed about in a K2 curriculum in USA how the neuroscience is integrated between the life science and the physical science, right? In our Indian curriculum, we barely have studies on neuroscience in our curriculum till 12th grade. We have either chemistry, botany, zoology, and a little bit of environmental science. That's pretty much our structure of knowledge, okay? Then if you go beyond in college, if you go for life science, then we have botany or zoology. In zoology, we have a little bit of anatomy, animal structures. That's pretty much we can get. Either if you're a psychologist, which you have basic knowledge of neuroscience, right? Not an in-depth one, you know, Freud, Skinner, Piaget, Picard, and the many theories. But other than that, I think we basically lack foundation knowledge on it, and we need to extra work on it. The teachers, especially, I mean.
Yes.
So.
Very excellent point. And I will let you know also that in the United States, there isn't necessarily neuroscience in the curriculum. What the Society for Neuroscience has done is provided an opportunity for teachers who want to, right? Because you'll see along the side that I showed you, it was physical sciences, engineering, life sciences, which is the equivalent of biology, zoology, right? I went to school in Jamaica, which is also under the British system. And essentially they would talk about like red biology and green biology. Like, are you going to do plants or animals? And I didn't learn about neuroscience until I came to the US for college. And even within the US context, people aren't teaching neuroscience. Like my kids aren't learning neuroscience in school. But what the Society for Neuroscience document and the Brain Facts document is doing is giving you an opportunity to use neuroscience to teach some of those core concepts. So what the core concepts that you are supposed to be getting in school, biology, physical sciences, here's how you can use neuroscience concepts to reinforce that. And what we do know about how people learn is that if they can engage with it, if they have something to work with, if you have something that you're interested in, if you've made an observation about the world or yourself, you're more likely to retain that information. Right? So if something is meaningful to you, which very often neuroscience concepts are, because you can talk about language and somebody immediately has an interaction with language. How can I use language to teach you about the physical sciences? How can I use language to teach you about physics? How can I use neuroscience to teach you about the way information flows, right? And so that's what that chart is. So don't think that the United States is leaps and bounds ahead of you. No, not at all. Not until many of the students get to college do they even discover that neuroscience is an option. So I teach in a neuroscience major at Emory, but many of my students are just figuring out what neuroscience is. And that's fine. So for your students too, all I'm suggesting is you can sneak in some really, really meaningful learning for them by tying it to things that they're already thinking about anyway. And that's part of the reasoning behind using sleep. Like, everybody sleeps. So if we can start to think about what sleep means and when sleep transitions into something that's a little bit different state of consciousness or attention, then you have a whole wide world of things that your monastic students are already thinking about that they can then refer to and understand the mechanism. That was not a short answer, but hopefully that
Gillian, I just have a quick follow-up question on that I wonder if the question was related to is, there may be some variability or some differences in how familiar the teachers are with neuroscience. So there's, from one angle, it's how do you use neuroscience to teach the diversity of biology, but in the other side of it is, how do you best prepare to teach neuroscience if you're a new instructor in the program and you're not necessarily trained in neuroscience? And I'm just off the top of my head wondering what might be the best resources for incoming instructors to get some grip and familiarity with neuroscience. And to be honest, the first thing that I thought of is the ETSI Neuroscience, the 6 books. And I do think that those will be a great starting point to really study and get familiar with. But I was wondering if you had any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the curriculum is based around providing the teachers with enough neuroscience knowledge to accomplish exactly that, right? So acknowledging that you might be coming in as a physicist or a microbiologist, right? But here's how we're going to teach you enough neuroscience, like in the next 3 years. These are the tools I'm going to provide to help you to be able to teach in the monastery. So those resources, the primers, are excellent. And exactly, I'm seeing a comment in the chats that monastic students have been thinking about or studying consciousness, and it's a point to link with. So that's really the argument behind studying neuroscience, is that it's a more relatable place to start to understand these elements that we take for granted in neuroscience, right? So you can start with these concepts. The primers are excellent, but throughout the curriculum and always, I'll try to provide resources, and I know that there are many other things. There are lots of textbooks that we've been putting together and translating. But again, the Society for Neuroscience Brain Facts, we translated that very early in the process. And that is a really nice resource as well. So between the primers and the Brain Facts, that's a really great place to start. And then don't forget about your resources, the human resources, because we're available too, right? And I'm happy to help. Yes? Other ideas, reflections, thoughts? It's pretty ambitious, but I think it's going to work. All right, Kelsey.
Thank you. And I actually, first, I have a question that I was just sort of waiting to ask.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about, so if we, in language, if we don't have a word, say for a feeling, then we might not actually be experiencing that feeling. Mm-hmm. So my question for that is, could you maybe share with us an example of how you might go about teaching that in your class?
Yeah, so again, with a lot of these things, the research, right, you want to support things. Many of them turn out to be stories that people have been telling, anecdotes, but Boroditsky, I don't know her first name, does some really interesting work on language and cognition. There's a really neat study on the word blue, right? The color blue. So I think Russian speakers have two different words for the light blue and dark blue. And I don't know how it works in Tibetan at all, right? But they have different words for light blue and dark blue. So if you show English speakers and Russian speakers series of blues, and you show them and ask them to categorize them, Russian speakers are more sensitive to variations in blue, so they can catch a little bit of a change. So as you perceptually change it, so you can bring up the blue or down, and they are a little bit more sensitive and can catch the difference before an English speaker generally. And some of the thinking behind that is because they have a word for it separately, it's two different concepts, you have a way to quickly work with it. Whereas if it's all blue for an English speaker, then it's a harder thing to distinguish, right? We also see that with things like facial expressions. And this one's actually really neat. So not so much language, but just on this is the theory, or rather the idea that your brain structure and function relates to how you do life or how you experience things, right? So being able to recognize someone's emotion from their face. So your face, there's some universal facial expressions, and you can tell when someone's surprised or sad, and you can change with very, your computer generated image, you can move very incrementally from a frown to a smile, right? And they've found that folks who have had Botox, right? So we talk about Botox, botulinum toxin, but for the wrinkles, right? When you get cosmetic injections of Botox, some people do it for headaches, but you reduce the dynamic range of facial expressions that you can make, because you don't have, you can tell I'm frowning, or you can tell I'm surprised by some of the stuff I'm doing. But when you have Botox, it reduces how much you can do. After a while of reducing how much you can do, it also reduces how much you can read. So your ability to produce these facial expressions, right, then influences your ability to read these facial expressions. So after a while, there's subtle changes, and not enough to affect your life. You still know when your kids are sad, but if you can subtly change over from, neutral to happy, they're a little slower at detecting those subtle differences because of their changes that their brain has made to accommodate their incapacity for doing it. So that's a kind of a long explanation, but the brain is really good at doing that. The brain does really good stuff, and if it's good at something, it's even better at other things, right? And so that's the idea behind practicing. So when the Tenzin Gyatso monks are walking around campus and they're well, not anymore, coronavirus, but when I would run into them and they're a group of 5 of them talking to each other in Tibetan, and I'm speak in English. Because if you speak in English, then you're going to remember your English better. And the more you practice is the better you are at doing it, and you hear it. Do you start dreaming in English yet? Or are you still dreaming in Tibetan? And while you're here in the US, you might as well talk English, right? So that's the kind of thing where your brain really gets good at doing these things. And then, and so these subtle differences in how you can receive information and how you can experience things, this embodied cognition, becomes really important. And I think, maybe not many people study that, but there are really good, reliable things that we can look at how to do.
Can I just make a super quick plug for the research training on that aspect, Kelsey, which is that, next Wednesday when we discuss research, we'll discuss, and eventually, hopefully the monastics will learn to we'll have some exposure to instruments and techniques that allow us to probe the emotional brain and parts of the brain that are sometimes outside of our awareness that can affect our behavior, and also use techniques that are really fast for studying the brain that allow us to study brain activity before even thought comes online, or maybe brain activity that we're not even consciously aware of, and how there's this whole world of the emotional brain that we don't even have conscious access to, but as Gillian nicely mentioned, affects our behavior, affects our perception. And so in the research portion, we'll be focusing more on neuroscience than other techniques in some respects. And you'll get, the monastics will get some exposure to how to probe these questions using research methods. So stay tuned.
Exciting.
Fantastic. So many exciting things. Let's see. So I am going to invite you all, and if you need to go grab it, that's okay. But if you can have a pen and paper or a pencil and paper, it's not required, but I am going to invite you to sort of have that by your side. Okay, awesome. I see some of you already have it. Also, so I'll share too. Actually, I have my Gundam notebook, so I'm also ready. And yeah, like I said, if you do need to go ahead and grab that, now is a good time to do that. Especially because I'm going to just share a really quick story about language, because I have been taking Tibetan lessons, well, I guess formally since April. But so I'm working on learning to read, so I can see, Lekpa, that you're cold. It's kind of cold here. Yeah, it's kind of, my hands are very cold. It's also cold here. So maybe I'll need to get a blanket later as well. And actually, I think, Gillian, we could have totally pulled it off and said that we planned everything, because so many of my things are very, very connected with what you mentioned, but I think in a good way. So we'll be good to go. All right. This is going to be a team effort, by the way, but let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started with that. All right, so we were just talking about all of these textbooks that we have for each of our science subjects. And I like this photo because it has them all there together. And especially now that we're going to be talking about like the integration and the connection between all of our sort of different disciplines in biology and neuroscience and physics. We have all of those books here together on this table, and also with our C-learning books too. And this is a picture from at Drepung in December of last year when His Holiness was there, and we had this really nice display there. And so I thought that was just a good way to start, and we can see, you know, visually we can see all of this information there, all of this information there together. And now we can talk about how it's all connected. First, I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about connections. Connections between biology and neuroscience. So I'm going to start with that. And then eventually we will expand out and include everything. And this is where I'm especially emphasizing this is a team effort, because I certainly am not an expert in all of these fields. And it really is, each and every one of you have had some experience either learning or teaching or both in all of these areas that I don't have. And so that's why it's going to be really important to have this team effort, and we'll share our own ideas and experiences with each other. This is a slide that, yes, it's very connected to some of the things we just saw. And I borrowed this from Ari in his talk last week, and I made a slight addition though. He shared this slide and had that this is a framework for biology knowledge. And what I've added in here, just so we can really see that it's all, when we're looking at biology and when we're looking at neuroscience, that there's a lot of connections here. And even just to really show these connections, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but then also all of our neuroscience folks, please do add in something from this, because I designed my whole thing to be a little bit conversational and a team effort. But we have on the left, we have all of these themes, and especially in the biology classes, these will be a lot of the big main themes that we actually see in pretty much every year of the curriculum. We do have the very set class for evolution, but it's still, that idea still comes up in all of the other years. And it's similar with the rest of these two. When we're talking about communication, maybe this is between cells, maybe it's between organisms. Communication is a big theme. And then it's the same with structure and function. The example we always use for this is like our hands, they have this structure and it allows us to carry out the function that they need to do. And regulation, energy flow, ecosystems, all of these end up sort of coming into every year of the curriculum. And I guess I'm sort of specifically talking about biology. And then that's connected with this living staircase too, where we're going sort of from very, very small when we're thinking about atoms, going all the way up to not even just a whole organism, but a whole population of organisms. And so maybe, is there anything to add from the neuroscience side about this?
I think what's one of the interesting things about neuroscience is that it is actually a biological science as well. So there's almost nothing you're going to say that wouldn't apply across to neuroscience, right? So you're sort of just the parent.
I have one thought, Kelsey. I love this slide, and I think it ties in with the idea that just like science as a whole, you can also approach the brain at many different levels, and that you have very different fields within neuroscience that study the brain at very different levels. So you might have a cellular biologist who's studying single neurons, or you might have a neurobiologist who's studying the anatomy of the brain, or you might have a human neuroscientist who studies brain imaging, and kind of using tools like MRI and EEG that we'll learn a little bit about in the research methods. And then you have, people who study the effect of the environment on human psychology and human biology. So what's really exciting for me about neuroscience and science in general is that you can study the question at multiple levels of analysis, and that there can then be this kind of, combined knowledge that comes together when you bring all those different levels of analysis together, just as you're doing on this slide. So I think you could take neuroscience and do the exact same thing with this slide at different levels of analysis, and they kind of all come together to feed our curiosity about the world.
Absolutely. And right, so this slide, there was a question that you asked last week, and that prompted me to specifically add this slide. And it's very related to what we were just talking about. So everything that is mentioned on this slide could be considered to be under this category, the broad category of biology, because biology is studying life. And on this slide, we're able to see that neuroscience is kind of one of these specific ways that we can study life. And there's a lot of other different sort of categories or topics on here also. And for us in the ETSI curriculum, having sort of the set class on neuroscience it's really just kind of emphasizing that there's a lot of interest there, there's a lot of importance there. And so we wanted to make sure that got, a lot of the dedicated attention. And many of these other ones are all incorporated into the biology classes in that 6-year curriculum. For example, we talk about stem cells when we're talking about developmental biology. And immunology is another one. And in year 5, that's the immunology and disease. And then we have a couple of others here that are familiar as well. Oops. didn't mean to skip that. Okay, so epigenetics, cell biology, and sometimes cancer can be incorporated into the curriculum. And so this is just to kind of show that they're very, very connected. You know, when we're studying neuroscience, it really is just a very specific and focused kind of way of studying some of the topics in biology. Okay, and so now this one you can see I'm bringing in the rest. And also I've added in a little bit here. I know that officially with our primers, with our textbooks, that we have biology and we have neuroscience and we have physics. And I've added in math here, although we don't necessarily have a full separate curriculum for that. I know that at a lot of the monasteries and also at the nunneries that there is still this inclusion of math in a variety of creative ways. I have been extremely fortunate to actually get to learn about some of the ways that you all are including teaching math. And so I didn't want to omit it here because it's very connected and very valuable. And I want us to be sure that we can talk about that too while we're here together. And here you can see that there's all these different areas of overlap. Some topics might be just within one topic. We can cover all 3 of these or all 4 of these. And sometimes we'll focus only on biology. Sometimes we might teach biology and physics. You can just see in the areas of overlap here that we can essentially have all the different combinations. And what we're going to get into here is actually sharing some of our own ideas and some of our own experiences of what are some of the ways that we can actually have examples of these topics in our classrooms. And that relates to how we're going to bring this all together. And so we are definitely relating each of these sort of subject areas to one another, all the science subject areas. And we're also kind of on top of that to connect everything. We'll relate to what Nina and what Sonam spoke about in terms of like, how will you actually teach this? How are your students going to learn this? And again, I'm going to keep reminding that it's going to be a team effort. And I'm really excited for this because I really enjoy hearing all of your teaching ideas. So this is the main goal that I have for us here today, for the rest of sort of, I guess I can't see the time, but we are going to practice sharing ideas for how, and this will be in your particular setting. So wherever you are, you know, if you're at Dribung or Gandin or Sarah or Jingtup Choling, wherever you are, we're going to practice sharing some ideas for how we can teach neuroscience and biology and physics and math. I didn't have the math to decide, but and math using everyday life examples. And I also point out, and this is very related, so we already heard Gillian already told us today about how practice, like sort of going through this practice of trying it again and again, that's how all of this will sort of be altering our own brains so that we can get more experience with teaching these topics. And so I very much was on purpose wrote the word practice here because this is a skill that we can work on and build over time. So we'll practice sharing these ideas for how we'll teach in all of these areas. All right, and so now this is where on your paper you can kind of get ready, and you might want to either just take a couple, like write down a couple of these ideas, or if you're on a computer and you have your phone or something, you could also take a photo. It's just whatever works for you. Also, you can just remember it in your brain. That's fine too. So at the top here, and you can, so I'll put them all up. And well, they're math also. I'm kind of putting math and physics together a little bit. You don't need to write out the full words for these. You can abbreviate it if you want. You could, on your paper, you can write, if you want, you could just like write N, B, and P. You can write this, you know, of course you can write this in Tibetan. I'm still working on that. I will have that skill someday. That's my practice. You could draw a picture for these if you want. If you want to like draw a little brain and a leaf or a cell. Physics, what would you draw for physics? You could draw like a planet, I guess. It's up to you, but just something, we're going for the different sort of categories here. And now what I'm going to do is, this is meant to just be a really broad overview, because now at this point, everyone has, even just in these webinars, and I know a lot of you have previous experience too, but even in these webinars now, we've heard some of the main ideas for each of the subjects. And this is just kind of meant to be a reminder for the next step of the activity that we'll go into. So these are some kind of big categories of things that we might learn about or that we might teach about in neuroscience. You have perception, vision, neurons, emotion, memory, and cognitive neuroscience. And there's many, many more as well. I did not, this is not meant to be all of the topics, just some examples. And it's the same with biology. These are some of the big picture ideas that we've talked about in biology. We've got evolution, genes, genetics, cells, development, disease, and epigenetics. And again, now we can take a look at these physics ones. And all of these, as I mentioned, you can take a photo, you can write these down, you can abbreviate them, draw pictures, just whatever is most helpful for you so that we can use these in the next step. For physics, we have mechanics, matter, heat, sound, electricity, magnetism, relativity, and cosmology. And I will say, I think, I know that we have also, thankfully, a lot of people on this call that have a lot of experience and expertise in physics. And so that will definitely be part of the team effort as well. All right, I'm going to wait just another second in case, just so we can take a close look at this, because we'll need to draw on this for the next step. So I don't want to rush through this part, because we're going to actually use all of this information. Just kind of. Hopefully, and we'll be in breakout rooms, and so even if you yourself weren't able to get every single one of these, once you have your whole breakout room, then we will be able to collectively share our ideas. Okay, this is our, so this is going to be kind of a practice round, and I think, well, let me check the time. Yes, we'll do a practice round, and then we'll do another round after this. So what I did is I went through and I got some of my photos of really good memories from the time that I have spent at the monasteries in India. And we're going to use these as examples for these everyday things. And so everybody can see this photo here. And what we'll do is we will go into breakout rooms. And for each of those categories, so one being neuroscience, one being biology, and the other physics and math, your team will talk about, or your team, your breakout room, will talk about, based on this photo, you can think, okay, so if I needed to use this photo to teach a topic in neuroscience, what would I choose? And there's a lot of options here. And I don't want to say too many ideas, because I really want to hear what you have to say. But then you'll do the same thing for biology. You're like, all right, it's the same photo. Now, how can I relate this to biology? Again, a lot of options. And then the last one, right, with physics and math. you'll look at this and say, okay, so, you know, we've got some food and we've got cups here, some spoons. How, if someone said, okay, you need to use this photo to teach physics, how would I do that? Okay, let me stop sharing screen because I am going to just check really quickly before we go into breakout rooms, especially maybe I think I'll ask, so for each category, we'll start with neuroscience and then talk about biology and then physics. And I'll just ask for someone to share in each of those. And we'll just go in order, but what your group talked about. So let's start with neuroscience. Could one person volunteer to share the ideas your group had about neuroscience?
Yes, Kelsey. Can you hear me? Yes. Hello.
Hi, Trishtale.
Trishtale.
And so, Lakpa, what did your group talk about?
Our group have discussed about those topics. In neuroscience, we found that vision and perception and memory, all those are related. We can relate those topics with the material that you have provided to us, like how we'll at a glance what we see, then it comes vision, then comes perception, then after that it deals with memory. So we found those topics are direct, we can use those as a source. And in the biology, we have discussed about that in disease it comes nutrition, so it's all like foods, so we can discuss about nutrition. Then little bit like genes, like mutation. And in the physics part, like it's deals with matter, and also any heat. Left from
heat.
Heat, yes, heat.
Mm. Oh,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And so may I put you on the spot a bit, and how, because you have a lot of good ideas for teaching math, I've got to say. So what do you have an idea for how maybe we could teach math?
Yes, like in this materials, we can classify things. We can use proportion, ratio, percentage, whatever. There are so many topics is connected. So we can, like with math, like I think math is the tools to make everything very like precise and visible, that we can know that how much quantity that required, so that tastes good, that proportion and all of those related.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so many amazing ideas there.
Yes, it's very difficult to tell because all are like, most things are like abstract. Like we have, it takes time.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's another great point too, right? Some of these things, they can be very abstract, but in some of these things, when it's our everyday life, you know, like making food or something like that, then it can be a little bit less abstract. You know, it's actually something that that we, you know, it's something we actually experience, and so then we can learn from that. Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe does one more person want to share? And then I want to make sure we have time to do one more of these, because this was the practice round. So maybe can one more person share what your team talked about? You can add to all of Lakpa's team's good ideas.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Sambola, please go ahead.
You go ahead, please. Sajlamala, you go ahead, please. Okay.
Okay. So, so our group has discussed about certain topics related to the picture. So from the physics, we have Pasala was mentioning about the topics such as heat, heat conduction and specific heat capacities, and how the in the image they are like certain food variety, and depending on the type of food variety, how does specific heat capacity differ? And he used this picture to illustrate how it is related to the image and how the heat is being maintained, and how fast the heat is being lost and something like that. And from the biology, we have Sarah Dinzi Changjuk. He was talking about the biochemistry part of the biology, where we talk about protein and carbohydrate, and what kind of like proportions are being protein source, and what are the carbohydrate source, and something like that. Mm-hmm. And from the neuroscience, Pinzo was talking about the basic principles of neuroscience, like stimulus and response, and what kind of stimulus stimulate certain response in the brain. For example, like vision, which talks about perception, and what kind of stimulus also enhance our appetite, and what kind of things, and the colors and stuff, something like that, kind of activate our brain, and then it creates certain response, like a need to have more and something like that. So these are the topics we have discussed within our groups. So thank you.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Fantastic ideas. And it did, when you mentioned the carbohydrates, it also, right, made me think of even just like all of the biomolecules, that's a perfect way to talk about this. Because I know in another group I was in, we were talking about the amino acids and then, any sugars and lipids. So I think those are fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to, for time, because I want to make sure we have time for this. So this is the photo we just looked at. And then, see, I have a couple of photos here. I don't know, which one do we want to use? Maybe we can just use the next one. I won't go through all of them. Okay, so this is another photo, and this is from the eclipse that happened, I think this was also in December. So we had the eclipse, and so that's what's happening in this photo, is that we have, those glasses to protect our eyes, because we wanted to look and see the eclipse, but also not, have any damage happening to our eyes. And so this will be, I think for time, this will be the last one, and I'll do a little bit more time this time, maybe. So I think we might go past our time just a little bit, but I will try to make sure that we don't go too late. It will just maybe be a few minutes over. So we'll do the same thing. We will go back into your.
How many minutes do you want me to put on this one?
This time, what do you think? Do we need maybe 8? Sundu, is that what you were saying? That 8 minutes would have been better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
so it'll be.
We know what to do now, so maybe we could be more efficient the second time. Maybe 6 minutes will work this time. You know how to do it.
Let's see. I don't know. Maybe I think 8 minutes is probably okay. And then we'll just come back and talk about it for a few minutes, and then we can wrap up. So I think we all got to see this photo now. So let me stop sharing the screen, and yeah, so it'll just be. So I don't want us to go too much over time. So I am just going to ask 2 people to sort of briefly share what you talked about, and then we can wrap up. And I mean, I'm available to stay a little bit in case you have questions, but I'm not sure about everyone else, Gillian, or.
I can stay for a little.
Okay, so we'll do that too. We'll just kind of wrap up, and then if you have questions, we can stay. So I think I actually somewhat pre-volunteered one of our teams, maybe Taekyung or Rangdol, someone in your team.
Okay, I don't want to waste time. So I will try. So of course, when we see that picture, so it's related to cosmology in physics, and also electricity and heat. So which is coming light from source. and also it's related with the in biology, gene, and also cell, because it has a radiation, and UV light can cause mutation in our gene. So that's why I think that's related to biology. And in neuroscience, yeah, of course, perception and vision, and also memory. These are, I think we had discussed about that. Actually, this is Teng Kyung's idea, but he don't want to come. So yeah, I had to speak out. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just briefly speak it out because we don't have much time. For us, in physics-wise, we observe that it could be a planet rotation due to which the event is occurring, or with the glasses, which is protecting us from the sun rays, right? It is blocking from UV or infrared like that. And then from biological perspective, it's very nice. The circadian rhythm of the insects during the they create the eclipse time. A lot of insects make that cricket, especially make chirping sounds. We kind of notice that. So that's a very biological system we observe. In the terms of neuroscience, yeah, the perception, perception of we try to close our eyes for that when we have exposure to sun. So that's a neuroscience. I think that's pretty much. Next, please.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. And so that we don't take too much time, I just have a couple of last things. Well, again, just to say thank you, and it's so wonderful to see you all. I really, really enjoy our time here together. And then just to sort of wrap it up, I guess. So one, I hope, right, we've all seen it from these very much like everyday life scenarios, is we can definitely connect all of them to any of these subjects. They connect to biology, neuroscience, physics. And so I said that that was my goal for today, but I actually did have a second one that I think we also achieved, and I just didn't write it on the slide, is that hopefully we can also see, right, that this is such a resource, like this whole group, our whole community that we have here together right now, is that there's so many good ideas, right? Just all of the ideas that I was hearing as I went to the different groups, that if you all are using those in your classes and talking to each other and saying, oh, hey, I had this idea and I had this idea, like that is fantastic. You'll have more than enough ideas to teach really, really amazing classes. So actually the two goals, right? Very connected to a lot of everyday things. And we have this amazing resource, this amazing community. When you all are able to talk with each other, there's a lot of great things. So I think I'll say thank you, and maybe Gillian, I don't know if you have.
No, Kelsey, that was a wonderful summary to connect everything. Thank you all for your attention. And again, we're always here. Even though we're in different time zones, we're still available.